Hello everyone and welcome to round number 4 of this county championship tournament which I played now a week or two ago. In this game I'm up against a 1900 rated player, but he's had a really good performance so far. He drew with a 2250, so he's definitely either a little bit underrated or just on very good form this tournament. I started with a pawn to d4, he started with d5, and I continued with a quick c4, going for the queen's gambit. And he actually accepts it, which is quite weird. Most people don't accept the queen's gambit at the higher levels, but he obviously came well prepared because after e4, he quickly blitzed out pawn to b5. And he told me after the game that this was something he'd looked at a while ago, but actually wasn't expecting me to play d4, so he hadn't prepped it super closely. So already at this point, I was actually out of mainline book. I actually went off what my course recommends, which by just playing pawn e4. I mean, it makes a lot of sense taking space in the center, but e3 nowadays is apparently a more simple way to go for an advantage with white. But I went for e4, he played b5, protecting his pawn, and I went for a4. At this point, I thought that b5 was actually not a good move. Turns out that it's theoretical, but yeah, apparently I thought it didn't make much sense because I was just going to try and undermine it with pawn to b3. And this move b3 would be very good. The main idea is that obviously if you take the pawn, then I take this pawn, and then after this capture, I would take with the bishop. This queen can capture this way. This bishop comes out here. Knight comes out here. Very quick development. I have the full center, and white is borderline winning here if I were to turn on the engine. But he didn't go for this and instead played the very sharp move e5, and this is the only move to keep the advantage. And this is about where my opponent said his knowledge of the position ended, because like I said earlier, he had prepared this a little while ago, but he wasn't expecting me to go d4, so he wasn't super well prepared, which I'm quite lucky. So I continued with taking on b5. I was, like I said, completely on my own here. I had to think for 5-6 minutes, try and come up with a plan. I was considering, do I take on c4? I mean, what do I think of positions with like b4 here? It all looks quite weird. So I was considering all of these things and ended up settling on this one because I saw this line where bishop to b5, bishop d2, and expected queen takes on d4. And in this position, I had prepared either two responses. I wasn't fully sure which one I was going to pick. I liked the look of bishop takes on b4 as like a backup plan. This was my main idea, is that after this one, here, bishop takes on c4. I'm like two bishops, very well developed, knights coming out, castling quickly. Black is very poorly developed, and even though I'm down in exchange, I liked the prospects a lot, especially given that the queen is out of the game. And there's also previously ideas like queen d6, maybe even earlier on, that could have been quite good. So that was the backup plan. My other plan was on queen takes on d4. Do I maybe play rook a4? This looked kind of interesting, like queen e4. Do I go bishop e2, sacrifice the g pawn, then there's bishop f3, and I'm getting some big pressure over here. But I think I would have probably rejected this because I had some vague memory of seeing this bishop c5 move, which looks quite annoying, where he could go after my pawn here. And if I played bishop e3, then you just trade, you trade, and then you capture here, and this doesn't look good at all for white. I mean, he'll just end up with a position like this, and yeah, maybe I can try and survive, but I'm definitely not playing for a whole lot here. I mean, probably better is bishop d7 or something as well, with maybe knight c6. But anyway, none of this came on the board. He instead took on d2 with the bishop, which I thought was a small mistake because this just lets my knight develop and get into the game. I was expecting c3 here, in which case I would have played knight c4. And if he took this way, then I would take this way. And if he takes this way, then I play pawn e5. This was quite an interesting line that I'd considered. And there would have been knight d6. And my knight makes this very powerful square over here. My bishop gets to recapture. My queen gets to recapture. Maybe queen f3 even. Actually in this position, threatening a mate and threatening the rook. I had all of these ideas and liked the look of it a lot. So I wasn't afraid of pawn c3. Although I still thought it was probably the best move. After something like here, I thought maybe he goes knight e7, gives me the pawn, and then just tries to castle his king very quickly. And I thought this is what he should go for. But he didn't go for this. He instead took on d4, which I think was a little bit greedy, because now I play bishop takes on c4, and you can see I've got one piece developed, two pieces developed, right? And as you can see, he has no piece developed. All of them are on the back rank, all on the starting squares. So I was feeling really, really good about this position. Also feeling good that he couldn't go for a move like this, trying to sack the pawn, or not sack the pawn, trade the pawn, and get some development, because I have bishop d5, which he said was quite annoying after the game. He also wanted to play c5, apparently, but once again, there's bishop d5, and the rook is dead. So here is where my opponent went really, really, really wrong. He played bishop e6. He should not have played bishop e6, offering the trade here. He should have tried to develop with knight e7, I think. Knight f6 could be met by e5, which is a little bit annoying. And on knight d5, maybe I'm taking on c6, playing knight f3. And this pony's a little loose, but could be playable as well. I assumed that the best line was just knight e7 with a quick castle, but he did go bishop e6. And I got really excited here, because I saw this line from afar where I can go takes, takes, queen h5, g6, queen e5, queen f6, and then b6. This was my really cool plan, where I can sacrifice the queen and then play b7 to make another queen and win a rook. I'll put it on the board, but once we got closer to the position, you'll see I noticed at this point that unfortunately for me, b6 resource does not work, because if I play b6, he would just simply capture this way instead, and my rook would be hanging, my queen is hanging, and if I take the queen, he takes with a check, and I cannot take the rook because he takes this way and protects the knight from behind. So I was a little bit sad to see this, because I thought it was really cool, this idea of trying to get the pawn into b7 and promote to a queen, because the queen has no way to stop it. After d3, something like rook b1 I considered, and then the queen has no way to keep up pressure on my rook. You can play queen h5, but then knight f3, blocking the checkmate on e2, and the rook ends up perishing, and I would get a new queen. But if it doesn't work, it doesn't work, and luckily I spotted that I could not do this, so I ended up playing queen c7 after a very long think, mind you, which is because there were also quite a few tactics I had to consider to commit to this queen c7 move, like pawn d3, for example, attacking my rook in the corner, but I noticed I have e5, and that removes the queen from this g7 square, so after queen f5, I can go queen g7, which simultaneously protects the pawn, by the way, and he can go queen g4, but then I have knight f3, this knight protects e4, and I'm not too concerned about this. I have rook to g1, he goes here, and I take this rook in the corner. So I think this really nicely illustrates why, as a beginner, you're taught to get your knights out before your bishops, because that way you can castle quickly, your rooks are free to move around the board, whereas in this position, both of his rooks were trapped and poorly placed. Additionally, I had to consider what do I do on queen e7, but this one's not too hard. I can just go for queen to c8. He goes queen d8, then I go queen b7, and again, this rook is trapped in the corner. And if he goes knight d7, then I have pawn takes on b6. He cannot go for this in-between move because I have in-between move number 2, and I capture on d7. And if he tries instead to save his knight like this, then my queen swings back around, and I end up grabbing the other rook in the corner, and there is no queen f6 because the pawn is on e5. And in a very similar vein, if he doesn't try d3 with e5 and instead goes for the immediate queen e7, then just queen c8 again, queen here, knight d7, pawn c6, knight c5. And in this one, there isn't any more queen g7 because he has queen f6, but I do have c7, which forces queen c8, and then I have queen c6, which attacks the knight on c5, forces knight d7, on which I can play queen takes on e6, and at the very least, this position is completely crushing, even if black is somehow not losing one of their undefended rooks. So quite a few tactics in the position still, but all of them seem to work pretty well, and he goes for the desperation, but also necessity move, knight to d7. I take on c6, expecting knight c5 now, he plays knight c5, so I go knight f3, protecting against knight d3 with potential pressure on my f-pawn. He plays knight d3 anyway, and I play this pretty poor move, king f1. I gave it a little bit of thought, but I definitely think king e2 is the way to go, forcing knight f4 and then king f1, because then I get to get g3 with a tempo, which you'll see how important this is later on. that I would get this g3 move, and then my king can live out on e2 permanently, as that way my rook is able to get into the game quite quickly. But none of that happened, because instead I played king f1, but this allowed him to get knight e7, and already I thought I'd thrown away some of the advantage here, even though it turns out that I actually hadn't, because after queen d7, king f7, I could have simply played pawn c7, keeping my pawn on the board. I have no clue why I didn't do this. Maybe I was just tired at the end of the double round day, but this is simply inexcusable not going for c7. It's just a must. I mean, it stops the rook coming here. My queen can then collect over here. And if he plays here, then there's this very obvious move, queen to b5, attacking the knight. He goes here, I play g3, and the knight essentially gets booted to the side of the board. And you'll notice it would have been much better now if I had played g3, the knight returns in the other line, like if I illustrate it like this. If I had gone king e2, knight f4, king f1, then knight e7, queen d7, king f7, like this, then I can go g3, knight d3, queen b5, and you'll see that there would have been no more knight f4, knight h5, and the knight would have died, wouldn't have made it to the side of the board. But I kind of messed up when king f1, messed up again a little bit, I mean a lot bit this time, and went queen d4, which is a really, really sloppy move. He could have gone knight c6 here. This is the move that I was expecting, because he exploits the fact that my rook is hanging in the corner and I cannot take the knight. And in this position, I was just going to have to go for takes, g3, rook comes in, king e2, something like knight b5, and I was going to have to play this position pawn up. Still good chances for white, mind you, but nowhere near as winning as it was before if I'd kept the pawn on c7 alive. But my opponent didn't spot that. He traded the queens first and played rook c8, which I think was a little bit inaccurate. If he'd played e5, maybe there were still some good chances here to try and play on. I was thinking here, knight c4, puts big pressure over here. He can try and build up a little bit, similar g3 stuff going king e2. And we get a position like this where I think, once again, white is doing quite well, because this pawn is very, very weak, and my rooks are coming into the game right after king e2. So I don't think he liked the look at that position very much, but probably still better than what he got, because after rook c8, I go g3. This g3 was actually quite poor, because I should have calculated a bit further. After king f3, e5 is what I saw. But if I had seen knight c4, which is a very, very cool move, and the fact this pawn is loose, and that if you take it, I check you, then take your rook in the corner, and after the recapture, I take your knight. If I'd calculated a little bit, seen this line, then I would have won quite cleanly, I think, because there's not many better moves than this knight f4 and e5. Because if I go king f3, and he plays knight h5, then I'm just holding onto the pawn, and life is very, very good. I have active pieces, his knight's very passive, and if he plays this, then I have this one, and he cannot capture with the knight because I have this check here. And if he captures with the rook, then I think I can just exchange and activate my knight to c4, and then knight b6 is coming, this pawn is loose, and all looks pretty good for white. So definitely should have gone for this line. Instead, I went g3, which is a pretty big mistake. He played knight takes on c6, I took, he played rook takes, and I went king e2. He played rook d6, which I think was the last straw here. If he'd gone rook c3 to try and hold the knight from this direction, then I wouldn't have been able to get a pin down the d line, which you'll see how that happened later. And after my rook would have come into the game, he could potentially play this knight b4 move, and try to hold the position, although it is still very, very weak for black. But he instead went rook d6, and after this one, the position fell apart quite quickly. I brought my knight into the game attacking the rook. He moved his rook back. I brought my rook into the game. He had to go all the way back to get it defended by this one, otherwise the knight would have been pinned and lost. And after he saved his knight, then I exchange the rook, grab the pawn, and bring my knight back, protecting both the pawns, and I'm just 2 pawns up in the ending. Although that b pawn is a little bit temporary, because he goes after it with rook to b8, but I play this move rook e7, overworking the knight so that he cannot trade this way, as this pawn would be lost. He played h5 because he cannot play king f8, as this pawn is weak. And after h5, which is a move that I was looking to induce, I played h4, solidifying the pawn structure for the endgame in an advantageous way, and noticing this path which my king will be able to take in order to apply a lot of pressure to his pawns and potentially just capture all of them. So he now plays king f8, kicking my rook off the pressuring of this e6 pawn so he can capture on b3. And I play rook h7. I quite like this move, it's a little finesse. The point is that you still cannot take this one because I'm threatening this skewer here to win the rook, and I attract the king further back to a more passive square so that then I can move my rook to the side and the king will be worse placed for the rook ending. Now, this whole idea was a little bit inaccurate. I should not have tried to play this as just a pure rook ending, I think. And it turns out that the best way to win this ending is actually something like rook c7, force the knight capture, and then bring my knight into the game. Just because his pawns are so weak, I'll have all of these targets like this. His knight remains kind of out of the game, and so does his king. So I definitely didn't consider this. I oversimplified the position just a little bit after rook a7 takes because I thought I had enough juice to force a win here. I think the engine says I do have enough to force a win here, but it gets a little bit dicey. Although I did see this whole point after king g8, this attraction idea, is that now I can go rook e7 and tie his rook down to the b6 square, and then use that time to invade with my king. He plays king f8. I go rook d7. Once again, tiny bit of a sloppy move, a little bit, against the principles. Generally, you want your rook as far away as possible, and I think that is true here because he can try and use this rook to gain tempos. But the move e5 is basically forced. He has to stop my king from invading and taking all of the pawns. I then move my rook over to d5. This was my idea, and tie his rook down to e6. So I've transformed the position, made him get a little bit passive on the defense, and now play this move rook a5. But you'll notice that if I had just played rook a7, I could have played rook a5 immediately, which means it would have been my turn to move in this position, and I could have simply played f4, which would have been a very, very easy winning position. But a little bit sloppy, a little bit rushed. I was moving way too fast in this ending. I thought this is just essentially game over, and I absolutely was rushing my way through this endgame. He played king f7, king g7, and king h6. Might have been a better way to hold, or king f6, depending on which way I go. But it's pretty hard to fault it. These rook endgames are very weird, very complicated, and now I strike with f4. He played pawn takes, I played pawn takes. He went rook b6, trying to either give me checks from behind or go after this newly created weakness on h4. But I just go king d4. Now the king is invading. He doesn't have time to go after this pawn here, because in that time I'll play this, check here, and then I'll try and checkmate him on the back rank whilst picking up this pawn. He brings his rook to the back, and I play king e5. And this is a huge, huge mistake. The problem is not rook h1. This one I saw, because I just give check here, for example, and then I threaten a mate. I start collecting these pawns. Or if he goes back this way, I threaten mate like this. If he goes this way, then I think I can just go for like king d6, sacrifice all of my pawns like this, king e5, back, check, forcing the king away from the pawn like this, and then it looks like my pawn kind of just makes it. Like if he checks me here, then this doesn't work, and king f7, I just meet it with rook f8 here, promotion. And this is completely winning because my king is very close and I will be able to catch these pawns. So this endgame was not reached because he didn't go after my pawns from behind like this. And instead, he played rook b7, which was the passive move. The reason, by the way, this move was a blunder is because he had rook f1. If he played rook f1, this disallows f5 because we would end up in a position like this where captures. He would check me, and we would play a position where I win both of the pawns, but it would be at f and h versus 0, which is actually a draw. Now, I'm not going to get into why it's a draw, because I'm not 100% sure why. All I remember is that I know that this is a technical draw, and would have been quite annoying if my opponent knew how to defend this accurately, although I still would have been pressing quite a lot in this position. But he ended up going rook b7, which is passive defense. Passive defense never works. I play f5 now, rook b6. And the big difference, by the way, is that after the capture, I can play king takes. and now it will be h and e instead of f and h and e is a draw because the king is going to be split too far between defending against the pawns. But he went rook b6 instead. I played rook a7, he moved his king back. I play f6 now, keeping the pawn on the board, so I've now got two connected passed pawns ready to roll down, and queen. He gives me one check, I play king f4, and he decides to resign the game. The reason he resigns is because I'm just going to go e5, I'm going to go e6, going to go king g5, going to go king g6 potentially, and he simply cannot stop the pawns going forward, which will create a checkmate threat, force the rook to the passive defense, and then my king will invade. So good moment for him to resign, of course. Unfortunately, he messed up a little bit in that rook endgame, though practically speaking, it was incredibly hard to hold or even give any chances of holding these pawn up rook endgames. I always give them as like 70% win, 30% draw. People say all rook endings are drawn. They are completely wrong. All rook endgames are theoretically drawn, but practically extremely hard to play. And at the end of the day, all that matters is practicality. The theoretical stuff is kind of irrelevant. So yeah, that's the end of this round. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you do enjoy my style of teaching, you might be interested in some one-to-one coaching, then check the description, send me an email. I've only got room for a few more students, so if you want to be one of them, then you might want to get in now. But other than all of that, thanks for watching, and I'll see you all in the next video. Bye!